This is Narva in Estonia, a city that doesn't look so special at first glance, but at second glance it is, because Narva is probably the most Russian city in the European Union. Only this river separates the Estonian city of Narva from the Russian town of Ivangorod. At the narrowest point, Estonia and Russia are separated by just a few meters here. And that's not all. Narva itself is also very Russian in character. If you walk through the streets here and listen to the conversations, you will hardly hear anyone speaking Estonian. The majority of the approximately 54,000 inhabitants identify themselves as Russian and also converse in this language. This little curiosity at the border has grown historically. In the past, Estonia used to be part of the Soviet Union, and Narva used to be an important industrial location. That's why many people with Russian roots came here and settled here. However, today hardly anything remains of these golden industrial times. Industry in Narva collapsed already many decades ago. The unemployment rate is much higher here than in the rest of the country, and in many places the city itself also looks as if its best days are long behind it, and the relationship with Russia on the other side of the river has also become increasingly complicated over the years. Today it's not two Soviet republics facing each other here as they did in the past. No, today the European Union borders the country that invaded Ukraine in 2022. Ever since this war of aggression started, the atmosphere here has been tenser than ever before. And in the midst of all this are the residents of Narva, who actually have a lot of sympathy for the neighboring country due to their Russian background. Some believe that if Vladimir Putin intends to goad or test the EU and above all Nato, he could first try it here in Narva. Today we're going on a little tour through this unusual town right on the Russian border. What can you discover here? What Russian influences and relics from the past can still be found here? And we are also going to talk about the problems and the possible future of Narva. Also with the question, what do you actually do if you have a neighbor like Russia right on your doorstep? Well, let's find out. The sun is shining, I put some sunscreen on, and I think now it's time to take a little tour through Narva. I booked a hotel right next to the city center, which actually doesn't really look like a city center. There is not much going on here, and it's also not that far away from the border, and I think that's the first place we should go now. Yeah, and while walking there, we can do some sightseeing. And the first thing I noticed when walking through Narva is that the city is built in a very practical way. There's a large road running through it with functional residential buildings and office buildings right next to it. And Narva is definitely also a city of contrasts. You constantly see beautiful new buildings like this school here, for example, and right next to it, an entire abandoned hospital. Then there are also many office buildings and residential houses standing empty and falling into disrepair. And then just a few meters away, you again spot beautiful restored buildings like the town hall, for example. What's particularly interesting is that you can still find a lot of remnants from the Soviet era here. These residential buildings, for example, were built during that time, as you can tell from the inscription. And this building here is also a relic from that time when Estonia was part of the Soviet Union, a 12-story high-rise with a water tank on the roof. This building was built in 1969 and was revolutionary for its time because it was the first building in the city to have an elevator. And until the 1980s, also a portrait of Lenin hung on this building. However, you won't find such relics in Narva anymore today. Estonia has completely distanced itself from its Soviet past and has done everything possible to remove the remnants of that time from the cityscape. And perhaps that's also why the Russian influence in the city isn't immediately obvious. You can sense it when people walk by because they generally aren't speaking Estonian but Russian, but visually it's less noticeable in the city itself. There are occasionally shops with bilingual signs, but not all of them, but there are definitely no traffic signs or anything in Russian. You can only see that in very rare cases, like on private parking lots, for example. So even here, the authorities are making it very clear this is not Russia, this is Estonia. And as we walk around the old Soviet building, we find ourselves at Petri Square and right at the Russian-Estonian border crossing. This used to be the place where you could drive into Russia with your car. However, that no longer works. The border crossing is completely closed for vehicles and only pedestrians can cross into the neighboring country now. This has nothing officially to do with Russia's war against Ukraine and any security measures. It was actually Russia that closed this border in February 2024. The official reason is construction work on the other side of the border, and supposedly the border crossing will reopen at the end of 2025. Whether this will actually happen remains to be seen. As you might know, the Baltic states and also Finland have closed several border crossings to Russia in recent years. However, in Estonia, 2 border crossings are still open for traffic. Here in Narva, however, there is no way through for cars anymore. The border control booths are empty and not a single car drives through. And this is what the border between Narva and Ivangorod looks like from above. What you're seeing here is a bridge that used to be known as the Bridge of Friendship. And here's what's left of this friendship. There are thick vehicle barriers on this bridge, large concrete blocks to make sure that no one can get through. Okay, now we've seen a bit of Narva. I'm sitting on a bench right now with Russia in front of me. And I think that's a good time to talk a bit about the present, the past, and the future of the city of Narva. As I already mentioned, the city has some problems, and it's also quite curiosity with its Russian influence. And I think maybe we should take a look at the history of Narva first. How did this actually come about? The origins of the city of Narva date back hundreds of years. The city is first mentioned in records in 1223 and has been under Danish, German and Swedish rule at different times. Later, Narva becomes part of various conflicts and wars. During the Great Northern War, the city falls under Russian control. After the First World War, both Estonia and Narva enjoy a brief period of independence before the city is fiercely contested during the Second World War. It is occupied by the Soviet Union, then conquered by Nazi Germany, and finally retaken by the Red Army. What follows are decades in which Estonia is involuntarily part of the Soviet Union. Like in many other cities in the country, also in Narva, deportations of Estonian citizens occur. At the same time, many migrants of Russian descent move to the city. city. From then on, Narva serves as an important industrial center for the Soviet Union. The most important economic sector is the textile industry. There is a huge factory here. And the second most important is a power plant that supplies electricity deep into the Soviet Union. The city's original Estonian population, however, is not allowed to return to their hometown for a long time. And this also explains why so many people of Russian descent still live in the city today. Well, and then the year 1991 comes and the Soviet Union falls apart. This has also consequences for the now independent Estonia, but also for the city of Narva. This textile factory right behind me with once 13,000 workers today is empty. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the industry in Narva is no longer a state-owned enterprise, but must compete in the free market economy. However, this does not really work. Over time, the textile factory lays off more and more workers, which also contributes to the decline of the city. In a report from 2003, the German newspaper Hamburger Abendblatt describes the post-Soviet Narva as perhaps the ugliest and most neglected city in the new Europe. 2003 is the year before Estonia joins the European Union. The article goes on to say that the misery, the sheer number of unresolved and seemingly unsolvable problems immediately hits the visitor in Narva. The European outpost on the border with Russia, derelict, dilapidated, rotting. The newspaper reports on run-down Soviet-era apartment blocks, unfinished concrete monstrosities with empty window spaces and Cyrillic letters everywhere. Even though Estonia is soon to join the EU, Narva will remain a Russian city. The article concludes. Of the 70,000 inhabitants Narva has at that time, 6,000 are addicted to drugs. Unemployment rates hover around 30%. And while the textile industry is on the verge of bankruptcy, the city faces another economic catastrophe. The power plant, which once employed 2,000 people, is already largely shut down. It releases too much toxic emissions, and with it, Estonia can't join the EU. Even today, the city has not fully recovered from these problems. Of the 85,000 residents, today only 54,000 live in Narva, and the unemployment rate is around 12%, which also means there is some dissatisfaction in the city, and some believe this could become an even bigger problem in the future. Since many people with Russian roots live in Narva and many speak Russian, the city could potentially be a prime target for Vladimir Putin's war tactics. This is not a made-up scenario. A similar tactic has already been observed in Ukraine's Donbass, in Georgia and in Moldova. Russia repeatedly attempts to manipulate Russian-speaking and ethnic minorities to shift its borders just a little further. Military experts also warn of such a scenario in Narva. If Russia were to plan an attack on the EU or NATO, it would likely not begin with a large-scale war or something, experts say. Instead, Putin would probably try to test NATO's unity and provoke small conflicts here and there. And places like Narva are particularly well suited for such actions. The German military expert Carlo Marsala expressed doubts to the newspaper Bild. Would a NATO state risk a war for a small town of 50,000 inhabitants? Some might think twice about that. But if NATO didn't intervene, it would be finished, the expert says, because deterrence would be lost. And the current political situation, in which one can hardly rely on Donald Trump and the United States as NATO partners, makes the situation even more dangerous. Provocations from Russia have already occurred here in Narva. Last year, for example, Russia announced plans to redraw borders in the Baltic Sea. A corresponding bill was withdrawn, but just a day later, Russian border guards removed over 20 border boys from the river between Narva and Ivangorod. EU leaders saw this move as a classic act of ongoing provocation. There were also reports on satellite navigation jamming, surveillance drones, and buzzing blimps marked with the Z of Russia's armed forces near Narva. The concerns are that Russia could also stir up the population of Narva over time. Possible tactics include disinformation, targeting the Russian-speaking population here, inciting unrest and protests, and even pushing for autonomy. And there are also fears that the people of Narva might get involved in such actions, because many here feel overlooked and abandoned by both Estonia and the EU. For example, in September 2023, there was a heated debate in the city when the mayor decided to rename streets that had Soviet ties. Also, the annual Russian Victory Parade, which many people in Narva used to participate in, has now been banned. And during the redesign of Petri Square, which we just saw, the submissions for the redesign had to be in Estonian, which once again excluded the Russian-speaking population. All of this has led the Russian-speaking residents to feel increasingly like second-class citizens. Trust in politics seems to be quite low in Narva. Voter turnout here is 15% lower than in Tallinn, for example. And this, in turn, fuels populism. The far-right Estonian Conservative People's Party is now focusing its election campaigns on the Russian-speaking minority. And even Russia itself is constantly broadcasting to the people in Narva. Many here don't watch Estonian TV stations, but instead the propagandistic state television from Russia, simply because there are almost no Russian-speaking alternatives. There are reports that some people haven't even heard about the war in Ukraine, as it is portrayed very differently on Russian television. Some people say Estonia needs to do much more for Narva so that the people here finally feel taken seriously and the economic situation improves in the long term. But some also say the EU has a duty in this matter. After all, it's also about their external border. Julian Wood, a PhD student at the University of Cambridge researching societal divisions, writes in an article, the EU must not only provide financial assistance but also bring dignity to Narva. An effective approach would be to bolster the rights of Russian speakers to use and work in their native language. The EU should combat the inequality faced by Russian-speaking children. And when renewing the city of Narva, it should also ensure that the Russian-speaking language does not disappear. However, Wood also points out that things are slowly changing. Since 2022, for example, the Estonian government has been supporting Postimees, a Russian-language newspaper in the country known for quality journalism. This serves as an alternative to Russia's state media. And there are also efforts to finally boost the city's economy. In recent years, for example, there has been an increased focus on tourism. The city also applied for the title European Capital of Culture to draw attention to the location among companies and investors. The uniqueness of Russian culture here was also highlighted in this process. So we see the first steps towards a better future for Narva and its residents has been taken. And despite all the challenges and difficulties, there is still some hope for the future. Okay, here we are back in the hotel. That was my little tour through Narva. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something. If you did, then please leave a thumbs up. You can also hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss any upcoming video. And if you'd like to support me and my work, you can also do that, for example, on Patreon. There's a link down in the description. And you can also become a channel member on my YouTube channel. Then you will get exclusive stuff and new videos before everyone else. So you should check that out. So that's it for today. So I would say have a safe journey and see you next time.